Hi, I'm Dr. Blunt. You know me. Today we're talking about jus in bello, the justice of war, and jus post bellum, justice after war. Why is this an important topic? Well, open a newspaper if you're, old-fashioned, or open your newsfeed. Think about what is in the news today. Think about the war in Ukraine. Think about the war between Israel and Palestine. Now, this is circumstances where people have been very concerned about the behavior of agents in this war. In Ukraine, we think about the suffering of Ukrainian civilians, the abduction of Ukrainian children into Russia to be Russified. When we think about Israel-Palestine, we think about the attacks on October 7th, where civilians were targeted and killed in large numbers by Hamas. And equally, we are concerned about the civilian deaths in Israel's reaction to it. The principles of jus in bello address how we behave in war, because it's not just that anything goes. There are rules that need to be followed in order to constrain our worst behavior. But let's have a little look at the history of jus in bello. The notion that there are laws of war is not new. In fact, since human beings started fighting, we have had rules around how we regulate war. So for example, in ancient Greece, it was considered a holy obligation or religious duty to allow a defeated army to collect its dead from the battlefield without attacking them. In medieval Europe, the Second Lateran Council of 1139 outlawed the use of crossbows. Now, you might ask, why were crossbows made illegal? The answer is super, super simple, right? How long do you think it would take you to learn to use a crossbow? The answer is not very long. You got a crank, and you point it, and you shoot. It's pretty easy. You get a peasant, you give him one, you train for a couple of weeks, and you know how to use a crossbow. Now compare that to a knight. You got to learn how to wear armor. You got to learn how to wear armor while riding a horse. You got to learn how to swing a sword while wearing armor while riding a horse. It takes a lifetime to do that. A crossbowman trained for a couple of weeks can kill a knight. Crossbows are that powerful. They punched right through the armor. So the Pope came up and said, this is immoral. Might raise questions about the interaction between power and privilege and the ethics that govern war. But I love that example because it shows how power and ethics, they kind of have an unhealthy relationship sometimes. We might also consider things like chivalry, right? Martial ethos about honor in battle. And we can compare it with other non-Western traditions. Bushido, Furusiya. In the modern world, we have things like the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Conventions. Now, these address things like the use of poison gas, how you treat prisoners of war, how you act in a relatively humane way. So we have this long tradition of thinking about war as a constrained behavior, constrained both by personal ethics and through things like the conventions, through international law. Before we look at the principles that constitute the classical approach to jus in bello, we need to look at the independence thesis. Now, you might know this, right? The independence thesis claims that the principles of jus ad bellum, when you can go to war legitimately, and the principles of jus in bello, how you act during the war, are independent, right? So you can start an unjust war, but you still have to fight it justly. That's the major consequence. The justice of war has no influence on how the war is fought. How the war is fought has no influence on the justice of the war. They are two independent entities. A soldier fighting, for example, on the side of an aggressive state cannot be seen as being responsible for his or her government's actions. They are just following orders. A state that is subjected to aggression cannot respond by executing prisoners of war at random. You still are bound to fight justly. This produces the moral equality of soldiers. No matter what side you're fighting on, you have the same rights. Why should we assume the moral equality of soldiers, or for that matter, not consider soldiers criminals if they kill someone in combat? But a fairly well-known principle is that you don't kill other people, right? The prohibition of murder is a pretty fundamental thing. But why do we think that soldiers do nothing wrong when they kill someone, or indeed they do something good when they kill someone. So soldiers, whether they're volunteers or conscripts, don't decide whether they go to war or not. This is usually the case. They have no control over policy. They can't be considered responsible for their actions. However, soldiers at all levels do have a limited sphere of autonomy, right? They have a responsibility for how they behave in war. Now, as Michael Walzer said, even the pawns of war have rights and obligations. So how do these rights and obligations shape the rules of engagement? Does it mean that soldiers are liable to death when actively engaged in combat? Pitched battles are fine, right? But there's a principle that you don't shoot the naked soldier. Now, here's a quote from George Orwell. George Orwell, by the way, before I get into the quote, he was fighting in the Spanish Civil War. Like many people who were committed to principles of Republican government and resisting fascism, he went to Spain in the 1930s to fight, even though the British government was not involved. The sort of democratic powers stayed out of the war, but a lot of volunteers went. So he's fighting in Catalonia. And he says, thinking about his time in the trenches, he's looking over the trench and he sees something. At this moment, a man, presumably carrying a message to an officer, jumped out of the trench, and he ran along the parapet in full view. He was half-dressed and holding up his trousers in both hands as he ran. I refrained from shooting him. I had come here to shoot at fascists. But a man who is holding up his trousers is not a fascist. He is visibly a fellow creature, similar to yourself, and you don't feel like shooting him. Now, what Orwell is saying right now is that there are certain circumstances where you don't feel like you should shoot another person. And the prohibition here is that he doesn't want to shoot someone who isn't a threat to him. This is just a man holding his trousers above his head, running along a parapet. It's not a direct threat. Now, the problem that we have here is about necessity, right? It would be very good if the violence of war could be contained in the battlefield, right? Kept out of the rest of our lives. War isn't like that, right? Wars are not symmetrical contests like a boxing match, for example. Sometimes the only way victory can be won is through things like ambush and sabotage. Sometimes you have to begin to think about what is fueling an army. You have to destroy the state's ability to make war. Necessity may compel you at times to shoot the naked soldier. But when do we draw the line? And this is the principle of non-combatant immunity. There is a general principle that one should not kill non-combatants. Civilians and soldiers who are hors de combat, which means captured or have surrendered, they are immune from violence. They need to be protected. Now, this is common both in the theoretical work on just war theory, as well as the Geneva Conventions, right? We are supposed to protect innocent civilians. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't hard cases. Civilians often are engaged in the war effort. This is certainly true in the modern world. We have moved into an age of total war. Now, perhaps when just war theory had its beginnings back in antiquity, we could say that war happens on the battlefield, but it's very distinct. It occurs between usually professional armies that are relatively small, and we can relatively isolate them. Now, at least since the First World War, this hasn't been the case in major war, right? Societies as a whole get mobilized. We might ask the question, is it permissible to attack a factory that is producing arms even though it is full of civilian workers? Shouldn't these people be protected as non-combatants? The answer is that that's a viable military target, right? They are engaged in an activity that is essential to maintain the fighting capability of a military. You cannot say just because they're not wearing an uniform, they can be protected. But there are more difficult cases. What about farmers, for example? Armies famously march on their bellies, right? You cannot fight a war if you don't have food. The logistical dimensions of fighting a war are really complicated. So can, for example, you firebomb enemy farms? This happened in the Vietnam War often with the deployment of napalm into areas where rice was being produced by the Viet Cong. The answer is no. Why? What's different between a worker in a munitions factory and a farmer? Well, the farmer isn't obviously contributing to the capacity of the army to kill. Farmers make food that go throughout society. I cannot tell whether one grain of rice is going to go to a civilian, a child perhaps, and another is going to go to a general. You cannot make that distinction. Whereas I know a tank factory is producing weapons of war. Farmers are, under this metric, innocent people. They're protected non-combatants. They have rights, and there are certain things that you cannot do to them, even in warfare. And that goes for large parts of the civilian population. They may contribute to the war effort in a secondary sense, but that is not enough to suspend their non-combatant immunity. But we might say, well, what happens if we have a legitimate military strike? Say we're striking an enemy command post or a munitions factory, and innocent people die in the attack. Think about the drone war in Afghanistan and Pakistan to kill the leaders of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So between 2004 and 2011, between 2,300 and 2,900 people were killed in drone strikes. Estimates say between 390-ish, 780-ish of these people were civilians. 175 were children. This comes from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. If we accept the premise that it's legitimate to kill extremists in war, do we say that drones are acceptable given that they also produce a significant amount of collateral damage? This question has become especially urgent in the case of the Israel-Palestine conflict, where there has been numerous civilian casualties while the IDF hits what it is claiming to be legitimate military targets. How do we sort this out? How do we see the right and wrong in this? And the traditional question is the doctrine of double effect, right? What is the doctrine of double effect? It says that foreseeable deaths of innocent people are excusable in certain circumstances. The circumstances are this. One, the act is good in itself, or at least indifferent. It is a legitimate act of war. It's something that is going to contribute to winning the war. The direct effect is military or is morally acceptable. Killing enemy soldiers, destroying a munitions factory, disabling a command post. The intention of the actor is good. The evil is not one of his or her ends or a means to his end, right? It is a consequence that is a side effect. It is collateral. The good effect has to be significantly good enough to compensate for the evil. It has to be proportional. So does this excuse drone strikes? Well, possibly not. We have to consider whether there are alternatives, and we can see the problems when we look at Waltzer's doctrine of double intention, which amends this. He says a double effect is insufficient, right? Because it can legitimize actions that result in foreseeable and avoidable non-combatant deaths. It says that evil consequences have to be minimized. So the evil consequence in this case is always going to be the death of civilians. So he says that there has to be an obligation on armies to minimize the risk to civilians, not just make sure that it is outweighed by the good. We have to push down the danger to civilians as low as it can be. Now, the objection is going to be, well, that raises the risk to military personnel. And the answer to that is, yes, it does. This is not an easy thing to accept, but one of the things that people will point to is that soldiers have assumed a specific role when they get under military uniform. They are willing to take risks, or they are liable to risks that civilians are not liable to. And there is an obligation to take those risks on. This is why drone strikes cannot really be reconciled with the doctrine of double intention. Why? Because there are better ways of carrying out these missions that do not risk civilians as readily as drone strikes do. Because, of course, the problem with drones is that no one's really at risk. It's why they're popular with military commanders in Washington. Drones that get shot down, that's expensive, but you don't get the optics of body bags coming home. The human cost to the force fighting the war is much more minimal. We can think about that in terms of how other forms of military operations happen. Think of high-altitude bombing, which became very popular during the Balkan interventions by the United States. This was criticized because high-altitude bombing outside of the anti-aircraft defenses of Serbia was one of the major ways that Serbia was pushed out of Kosovo. But dropping bombs from really high altitudes is very inaccurate. A lot of Serbian civilians were killed in this. A lot of people thought this was bad. It would have been more moral to put more soldiers on the ground. But this carries with it its own risks. I'm not saying this is a simple judgment, but it is something that people like Mike Walzer say we have to do. We have to balance the risk to military personnel with really strong principles of minimizing the danger to civilians.